you. So as part of Crown Estate's role in facilitating delivery of offshore wind in the UK, my role is to have an overview of the planning and consenting issues and matters that are arising across the portfolio, both with specific projects but also at a strategic level. So today I'm just going to give you an update on where we've got to in offshore wind consenting and also some of the challenges that are facing us in the future. So I guess the top headline has to be in terms of the amount of capacity which has so far got consent. And in 13 years we've made quite a lot of progress, as you can see from the numbers there. We started off with a single demonstrator turbine, and now 6.8 gigawatts around about of capacity has consent. I'm not talking about any further than consent at the moment, so obviously consented capacity doesn't always translate into built capacity, but let's look on the positive side. It's worth reflecting that we've come a very long way, and there's a huge amount of capacity that has received consent. Having said that, the final box on that slide, there's a long way to go. So obviously there are targets for decarbonisation that require certain amounts of decarbonisation of electricity by 2020. We're going to need to get some more consents for offshore wind as well as other renewable technologies in order to meet those targets. I just thought it would be worth putting those numbers up because sometimes presentations about consenting for offshore wind can get a little bit negative, but we have come a long way and a lot has been done. So just to reflect on where we've come, that's a slightly out-of-date map of the UK. So we started off with a single demonstrator site, which did pop up there somewhere, at Blythe with 4 megawatts back in 1999-2000. Next up was round 1, which is the Crown Estate's first round of offshore wind. So that was significantly more sites around the UK. They were all relatively small and close to shore. Total 1.8 gigawatts got consented, with a couple of projects being abandoned for various reasons. And that was the beginning of consenting, essentially, for offshore wind, both the developers and the statutory stakeholders and regulators getting to grips with it. Next up was round 2. All of that except for one project, Triton Knoll, has now been consented. That's an additional 4.9 gigawatts. But one project has been refused, which Jonathan mentioned earlier, Docking Shoal in the Wash, for consenting reasons. So that's a bit of a shot across the bows. Next up, there's the round 1 and 2 extensions. We've had the first project from that now consented through the planning inspectorate regime. That was the Kentish Flats extension. Relatively small project at 51 megawatts, but never mind, it all adds to the total. And then there are demonstration sites as well, with 96 megawatts consented to date, judicial reviews from Donald Trump notwithstanding on that one. So it's a good record of consent. It's taken quite a lot of time and a considerable amount of effort to get there, but the consenting system we have does work. So that's to date. If I'd been doing the presentation in a week's time, I might have been able to add something to the extensions capacity. We don't know that yet. But what's to come? And here's some other numbers. So there's that 6.8 gigawatts that's already been consented. That includes all of the projects we've just seen on the previous slide. I've got 8.1 gigawatts in my consent decisions pending box. So that includes some of the capacity in Scottish territorial waters. It includes Triton Knoll and Galloper, and also the beginnings of round 3 projects coming into the system. So Rampion and East Anglia 1 are included in that. So that's actually quite a big chunk. Essentially, that's more than has already been consented, waiting for a consent decision. Over and above that, I've got a further 19.3 gigawatts in my box about consent applications that are in preparation. And I've defined that in terms of a developer having specific plans for a site and are progressing the consent application for that site and have an agreement for lease from the Crown Estate for it. So that's where most of the capacity in round 3 and the first projects from those zones is sitting at the moment, because those applications have yet to be made, and many of them will be made this year. And then there's another about 14 gigawatts still in the pipeline, in as much as that's capacity that developers believe they can consent within their individual zones, but they haven't actually started the process of trying to get consent for those. So what we're seeing here is an obvious challenge just by looking at those numbers. particularly because, as you saw on the previous slide, we started off with small projects, which were arguably relatively easy to consent, and now we're moving towards much bigger projects. They're much further offshore. The impacts are much greater, or potentially much greater, and so obviously there are some challenges being faced there. So the key points to note is that consent is only an interim goal. It's not the be-all and end-all. Just because you have consent for a project doesn't mean that it's going to be built out. And I'm sure Dorothy will speak a little bit later on about some of the challenges with financing some of those projects and getting them built. But on the plus side, it is definitely possible to get consent, and the system that we have does work. But that system is being stretched because we're now starting to push bigger and more numerous projects into the system. And that is obviously going to start causing more problems as we go along. So the next slide just shows a little bit about how we are stretching the system. I've got consent in the middle there as a goal, and I've identified 4 areas that contribute to a project's chance of getting consent. So that's support from policy and government initiatives. There's the planning system itself, the nature of that, how applications are made, how they're determined. There's the evidence that you need to support impact assessments in order to prove that your project is worthy of consent. And then there's the people and the resources to actually deliver the work. And obviously, the more you put into the system and the more consents you're after, the more stretched each of those areas is going to get, and the harder it's going to be to actually get consent for individual projects. However, in each of these areas, there are a number of activities underway to help the consenting process for offshore wind. We know it's going to be difficult, but there are things that are being done. So the first of them is policy and government. And there is policy support for offshore renewables and offshore wind. There are clear decarbonisation targets. Perhaps what DEC have identified as their scenarios are not as high as developers might like, but they're there. And the Scottish Government has definitely got very strong targets for renewables, as we heard from Fergus Ewing this morning. In addition, we've got the national policy statements for projects in England and Wales that Jonathan mentioned earlier, and those are very helpful in setting statements of need and providing support for capacity going into the system. The other thing that we've got is a lot more co-working starting to go on. The Offshore Wind Programme Board and the Offshore Wind Developers Forum are very aware of consenting issues and are starting to raise these at higher levels in government. And we're starting to see government departments like DEC and DEFRA working much more closely together on some of these issues. Again, Jonathan mentioned the Major Infrastructure and Environment Unit in DEFRA, which is starting to address some of the consenting concerns, and DEC are also very active in this area. In terms of the planning system, there's some definite good news. The industry has survived the transition from Section 36 to the Planning Act in England and Wales, as Jonathan was talking about. We've had our first offshore wind consent through that system, and actually it hasn't been as bad. 2 years ago, I had developers talking to me all the time about how awful the system was and how they didn't like it and they wanted it to go away. But actually, a lot of those fears haven't materialised. Some others have, that people didn't anticipate, but a lot of that's gone away. We've also survived new marine licence regulators in all of the devolved administrations except Northern Ireland. So we now have Natural Resources Wales in Wales instead of the Welsh Government. Marine Scotland and the MMO are both new bodies since 2010. So we're surviving that, and they seem to be being quite helpful at the moment. And marine planning, which is now starting to come in the UK, is also being relatively positive for. Obviously, this is going to be quite a major issue because if there's no space in a marine plan for an offshore wind farm, then you're not going to get consent for it. But actually, the marine plans, as far as we can tell at the moment, are actually being very supportive of offshore wind and renewables in general. And it's being taken very seriously. In terms of evidence, this is one of the major areas that's being worked on at the moment. And by this, I don't really mean baseline information for environmental impact assessment, but more evidence of impacts, for example, bird collisions or impacts on cetacean populations from noise. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. I think there's a lot of evidence gaps, a lot of learnings that could have happened from all the consenting that's happened so far and hasn't yet. But there is quite a lot of research going on. The MMO and Marine Scotland in particular are leading a number of initiatives in that area. There's also ORGIP, the Offshore Renewables Joint Industry Programme, which hasn't got off the ground yet, but we're hopeful that that's actually going to result in industry contributing quite a lot of money to actually undertake some research activities to find out what these impacts look like in reality. And that should be greatly beneficial to the consenting process by reducing the need for precaution in decision making and making a better evidence base for people to make decisions on. And there's also work being done here in terms of the approach to assessment. And again, I've put the Major Infrastructure and Environment Unit down there. So DEFRA are now looking very carefully at the way in which things like the habitats regulations are implemented and whether there's lessons that can be learned and better ways of approaching those things in terms of consenting to try and make life a little bit easier. And finally, in terms of people, there has been a huge concern about stakeholder resource because of the number of projects that are coming into the system. And I see most of the environmental impact assessments and other documents coming past my desk, and I'm very glad I don't have to read them all because my stack of DVDs is probably about that high, let alone the amount of paper if I printed it off, plus all the decisions that have to be made and the analyses that have to be made of that. So stakeholder resource has been a big problem. But the good news is that people are staffing up now. So all of the main stakeholders and regulators understand the amount of work that's now coming into the system. They've all made commitments to increasing numbers of staff and finding ways of improving the speed at which they can respond to things. And there's still work to be done there, but that's definitely happening at the moment. So just to conclude, we do have a consenting system that works. We are pushing it to the limits with what's coming through in terms of offshore wind. But the issues are quite clear, and there are a number of things that are happening in order to help the consenting. So although it's not going to be an easy ride, there's no cause for despair as yet. Thank you very much.